if you look at the map of the city of Boulder on which flood hazard zones has been plotted, you see it accounts for a significant part of some of the central Boulder and other areas. And so my first concern was in just the study of what was happening in Boulder, where, as an interesting fact, the Corps of Engineers, after the Flood Control Act of 1936 was published, made a study and felt that an area along Boulder Creek that was subject to floods ought to be protected by building a levee down along what's now Canyon Boulevard. And they offered to pay half the cost of building that levee along Boulder Creek if the city would pay the other half. The city had turned down that opportunity, and instead they built the city hall midway between the creek and where that levee was to go. Then, a few years later, they built the first library building midway between the creek and where the levee would go. And but the city was not the only agency that had done that. Well, lots of people had built down in the floodplain. My connection with Boulder as in an operating civic way occurred when in 1969, after the Federal Flood Insurance Act had been passed, I accepted an assignment from the City Council of Boulder to make a study of possible zoning of flood hazard areas in Boulder. And Kenneth Wright was a member of the City Council that introduced the resolution that they make such a study. I did it, submitted it to the City Council, and in 1970 the city adopted a floodplain zoning ordinance, and this was also discussed with the county. The university undertook to develop parts of the area in the floodplain for dormitories for students down along Boulder Creek, Athens Court and Newton Park and so on. And they did this in defiance of the city zoning regulations, because as a state institution they had sovereignty independent of the city. One of the first things that the city planners in Boulder did many, many years ago, around 1910 or 11, was to employ a distinguished New York planner. And he came and did some suggestions for city planning in Boulder. It was just a small town then. And he suggested that the city of Boulder, as it grew, should set aside what was the major floodplain of Boulder Creek and others for recreation and natural areas. And they rejected that recommendation, which to this day makes a great deal of sense, I think. And if where the old library, the city hall, are now located, was just park area with plenty of opportunity for people to go into it at suitable times and for recreational purposes, it would be quite different than realizing that both of those municipal investments will be subject to very serious damage. Fortunately, they built the new library, which is up above the basic floodplain, and they moved books out of that library. And fortunately, after a little study that was made a couple of years ago, the City Hall has moved all the major documents which were in the basement of the City Hall out of the range of floods. And that was done a few years ago. So that's very beneficial. And the city has actually bought some of the property that was of great risk in the floodplain and torn down the buildings, moved people out. I remember when the first time I came to Boulder was in 19 57, and I noticed down on the floodplain, a year or two after that, there was a new apartment building being built down on what is now part of the athletic field for Boulder High. And I talked to the fellow who had built the apartment and said, "Don't you think there's any risk in building in this location?" He said, "There's no risk at all. I will have sold this within a year." And he did. As you know, there were 139 people who lost their lives in one day up there. And I had some students here that worked on that. And one of the very interesting aspects of the results of that flood was that none of the people who lost their lives drowned. They all lost their lives because they were battered, or a log jammed through their intestine, or an arm turned off, or a stone on their head, and so on. None of them drowned. And as a result of some of those student studies and reports, you see the signs up along the hills now which say, in event of flood, flee to high ground.